Hi everybody, Professor Snart here checking in. Unit 10 we move into now, the Brownings, Robert Browning and Elizabeth Barrett Browning, two fairly typical Victorian authors in terms of their concerns and their approaches. And in fact, the two works that, or the various works, but the two that we're focusing on for this unit, which is Elizabeth Barrett Browning's The Cry of the Children and Robert Browning's My Last Duchess, are on the face, at least, very, very different kinds of poems. One is sort of this immediate poem about this very contemporary social issue in the Victorian period, which was child labor at the time. The other is Robert Browning's My Last Duchess, which is seems to be completely removed from the sort of contemporary scene. It draws on historical facts that are centuries old, but really those are, of limited use, and the fiction itself is removed from the everyday world of Victorian concerns. But that is actually a good reminder of precisely what we see in the Victorian period is just a lot of diversity as far as what artists are interested in. So you have everything from Alfred Lord Tennyson's really removal from the contemporary scene and the imagination of these very fantastical, almost medieval or knightly kinds of worlds, like the Lady of Shalott, for example. But on the other hand, just as often, you have writers who are addressing their contemporary social scene, whether it's someone like Matthew Arnold in Culture and Anarchy, or Elizabeth Barrett Browning with The Cry of the Children. So at the same time, you have these equally successful kinds of approaches or these kinds of styles happening. And in fact, like I suggest in the unit here, Robert Browning's poem is not so far removed from a kind of social critique, as it at first might seem, from Browning's Cry of the Children, which is much more obviously and immediately a social critique kind of poem. So the Brownings are a great literary couple, maybe one of the best. They were husband and wife. They were married in 1846. I have a picture of the house that they lived in Florence, Italy, which is marked as their residence that you can go and visit if you ever happen to be lucky enough to be traveling in Italy. And I have sort of a personally funny story that relates to this place particularly, but is a great example of what Wordsworth himself often wrote about, this idea that we have an idea in our mind about a place we want to go or a thing we want to see, and we've heard about it, we're excited about it, we're ready for this great kind of experience. And he includes this idea in many poems, but writes specifically about this one moment where he is traveling through a mountain pass, and he knows from various descriptions and from friends telling him that once you sort of get over this one hill, you get this amazing view of the mountains and the landscape around it. And he's getting very excited about this, and he's really built it up in his mind, and can't wait for it to happen. And he's waiting, and they keep going, and he's waiting, and they're up and down and through the mountains and all this stuff. And he asks the guide, or one of the people that he's traveling with, he says, well, are we going to get to this pass that he's been waiting for? And the guide says, oh, we did that about 2 hours ago. So Wordsworth, and he writes about this in a fairly humorous manner, this kind of way that we built things up to such a point that even if it was this great experience, it would never match his expectations. So this ironic kind of deflation that he'd passed this one moment hours before and never recognized it on its own, so had built it up in his mind to the point where he was looking for something that really couldn't possibly exist. That anecdote from Wordsworth's poetry has really stuck with me ever since I read it, which was decades ago, literally. It happens so often, maybe more often than we realize, but it precisely happened to me when I was in Florence, and one of the things that I knew was that Browning's residence was here. You could go and, if not, visit the actual thing, certainly walk past it. And I had my map, and I knew more or less where it was, and I walked everywhere looking for that thing, down every little side street, nearly walking into buildings that were just people's houses, for crying out loud. And and I could not for the life of me find it. So I finally asked somebody, and I was really excited, obviously, to be in Florence, Italy, which is awesome in and of itself. And then I had this goal, this sort of quest I'd set for myself, that I would find this the residence of the Brownings, and it would be very cool. And I would take a picture, and it would be really exciting. And finally, after hours of looking for this damn thing, I just asked somebody, and they said, oh, it's right there. I had probably walked past it 20, 30 times maybe. So I was ironically deflated, but it was fairly humorous, in as much as the first thing I thought about was this Wordsworth passage where he talks about more or less the exact same experience, which, like I said, once you become aware of it, it happens on a fairly regular basis. But anyway, into the Brownings, they provide this sort of ironic reversal, actually, of the Wordsworth-Dorothy Wordsworth relationship. So the Wordsworths were brother-sister, but they had a very productive creative relationship, even though obviously William was the much more the writer much more interested in being a public figure, having his work published. He was poet laureate for a while, whereas Dorothy was much more content to write in her journals and was never much concerned with anybody reading her work but those in her fairly small circle of friends, people like Coleridge and Wordsworth. The Brownings are a little bit different. They're husband-wife, but also enjoyed a very productive creative relationship. They were both successful during their own lifetimes, so it wasn't like one lived in the shadow necessarily. But if one was more famous at the time than the other, it was maybe ironically Elizabeth Barrett Browning, who was the much more famous writer and artist, whereas Robert Browning was well known, but even humorously referred to sometimes as Elizabeth Browning's husband, kind of a thing. So a sort of fun reversal from what we normally see in those situations, but one of the best literary couples maybe in the Western tradition, a kind of parody of artists or equality of artists that we don't often find. Okay, the discussion board question then is asking you what might seem like a sort of difficult question to get a hold of in terms of the poems that we're reading then. My Last Duchess by Robert Browning, and then Elizabeth Barrett Browning's Cry of the Children. Very different on the face of it, but I'm asking you to think about here both poets' use of voice. So voice can be thought of in terms of the speaker in the poem, the perspectives that are provided. So you can think of voice and perspective as very similar terms. It's important to think about voice as, of course, the power to be heard, which poets themselves have, at least ones that we're reading, because they're public figures. But how often poets choose to speak in the voice of another, and how that they can sort of animate characters that way, who either play off one another or voice certain opinions that the author needs, or how voice can be used for a character to really reveal more than he or she wants to, or to empower the voiceless, as might be the case in The Cry of the Children, where obviously the focus is the tragedy of child labor and its persistence, precisely because those who are most affected have no voice. They have no way of drawing attention to themselves but through the social critique of artists like Elizabeth Barrett Browning. So again, she kind of enables or empowers the voiceless by giving them voice within her poem. And she does so not by talking about them in this sort of objective way, but almost this sort of ventriloquism where she gives them lines to speak, and they, at least in the fiction of her poem, are able to actually say something. So think about the power that that has versus just the sort of observational thing that she might have done. Oh, look at that, tragic situation of children working in a mine or working in a factory. She takes the next step and actually empowers them as speakers in her poem. Maybe the next question to ask then is, in what ways, or if ever, that can be an unfair use of the poet or the artist's power in terms of having somebody speak, and does that destroy the sort of authenticity of what those people might actually say if they had the opportunity to say it? In other words, the voiceless are always empowered by somebody who gives them voice, but also, gives them the words to say. So that's gets into the complicated sort of question of who ultimately has the power in that situation, and certainly it resides with the poet. And maybe there's problems with that, but the good that it does outweighs the problems, at least in certain circumstances. So you can think about all of that as you're reading, particularly Cry of the Children. And then voice works maybe differently, but it figures very prominently in a poem like My Last Duchess, which is all about the dramatic monologue of this one speaker in the poem. So kind of interesting works to read, and certainly an interesting literary relationship to consider in terms of the Brownings here.